Hey there, welcome to this webinar on Essentials for Active Directory. Super happy to have you guys here. I see we got a bunch of people already signed on to this webinar. So really excited to have you here. And today we're going to get into the core foundations of working with PowerShell and Active Directory. So this is a topic that I really love because I've been working on Active Directory since the early days when it was even in beta back in Windows NT 5 before it was introduced in Windows 2000, and big PowerShell user over my career. So excited to have you here. We got people from all over the place, all over the US, New York City, Oregon, Texas, Edmonton. So, and in the chat, it's been kind of interesting because the World Series is starting tonight. We've got a lot of people basically saying who they're rooting for. So Dodgers, Blue Jays. So let us know who you're rooting for. I'm going for the Dodgers tonight because I'm in Phoenix. I was born in LA. I'm close. D-backs didn't make it. Diamondbacks didn't make it. So rooting for the Dodgers. But anyways, great to have you here. So the agenda for this webinar today is we're going to take a look at how to get Active Directory PowerShell module installed, whether it's on your local machine or on the server. Okay, and we'll explore the commandlets for Active Directory, the core foundational commandlets. And then we'll go through a lot of demos. So initially, I'm just going to do a couple of preparation type things, and then we'll get into it, a lot of code, and my team will share the code samples in the chat for the webinar if you want to download those. I'll also talk about more ways where you can get access to the code in a little bit. So let's get into it. What does the actual Active Directory module do? Well, as you might expect, it allows you to do all the administration that you would do in the graphical tools from the command line. So, this is really exciting for me too, because I think, I hear a lot of people talking about cloud, Kubernetes, all this kind of stuff. That stuff's great, but I like to be able to kind of circle back to, just looking at on-premises Active Directory, because that's still a big deal for a lot of Windows, Microsoft enterprises. And it kind of feels like, people sometimes just go forward into new technologies and then we're just kind of ignoring some of the core foundational stuff. So I'm excited to go through this because I know this will really serve a lot of you. So the Active Directory PowerShell commandlets basically come in a module. It's an extension that rides on top of PowerShell. Lets you do user provisioning, password resets, putting people in groups, cleaning up your Active Directory. I'll talk about that today as well. And so pretty much anything that you would do in Active Directory users and computers, through the graphical console, you can do in PowerShell with these commandlets. And even if there's not commandlets for that, ultimately in the .NET framework, which PowerShell is built on, there's all kinds of classes in there that you can use. So even if there's not commandlets, you could still do pretty much anything that you need to do in Active Directory to automate it. Now, this ships with domain controllers by default, the Active Directory module. So when you DC promo a domain controller in your environment, that'll install the remote administration tools, remote server administration tools for Active Directory. That'll include the Active Directory module. You can also install it on your client device. Now, important note here, down at the bottom, works on Windows, not on PowerShell 7 natively, not on PowerShell Core natively. So a big thing to take away here is, if you're using PowerShell Core on a Mac or Linux or something like that, or even on Windows, this module doesn't natively work because the module is built on PowerShell 5, which is built on the Windows .NET framework. But if you're doing PowerShell 7, you can always remote into a server that has those bits installed, okay? So no worries there. Now, when it comes to installing on Windows Server, you can use the Server Manager to add server roles or features, include the remote server administration tools for Active Directory. But one of the things I like to do, and I'm just going to jump over to domain controller real quick. I'm going to do get Windows feature on rsat-adds. So notice this is already installed because it's a domain controller. The DC promo process installed this package here, rsat-adds. So on any Windows server, you can install that package. That will give you access to the commandlets. And if I was doing this from scratch, I could just do install Windows feature, rsat-adds. It would do the install. When I run that here, you can see that nothing happens because it's already installed. So that's kind of the idea with installing it on Windows Server. And this happens, or something you can do on Windows Server 2012 and higher, okay? So that's on the server side. And then on Windows 10 and 11, the tools are built into the OS, a little bit of a different operation. You're going to settings, optional features, and then you add the tools. So let me show you that real quick. And I'll try to make sure I'm answering your guys' questions. See, Andy says, doesn't work natively, doesn't work in quite the same. Is there a non-native approach? Yeah, so good question, Andy. So before I was saying that you couldn't install the Active Directory module natively on Windows 7, but they do have a process. Microsoft has this documented in their documentation. It's not trivial. It can feel a little bit kludgy and kind of buggy setting it up. There is a way to get it installed. So if you're on a Mac OS with PowerShell core, there is a way to get that going, but it's not an easy task, but they do have that documented. But at the end of the day, you know, if you've got remoting enabled on a Windows server that has the tools installed, that has the module installed, you can just do a remote session and invoke the commandlets on that machine. That's a really good question. So let me show you this real quick. If we're on Windows 10, I'm going to use the PowerShell ISE to do some demos. But if you're on Windows 10, if you go into the Start menu, you go to Settings, scroll down, go to Optional Features. I know it's a little bit tough to see there. You would basically just search for RSAT, Remote Server Administration Tools. And you can see here that I've already got it installed. So on this Windows 11 machine, I went through that process. This machine is domain joined. I signed in as an administrator, installed these tools. Now I can just open up PowerShell on this machine and run any of the Active Directory commands that I want, just like if I was using Active Directory users and computers to do graphical administration. And if you're not signed in as administrator, you can always provide your credentials. There's usually a credentials parameter, and you can do it that way. All right, so that is kind of like the high level of just making sure that it's installed and ready to go for you. Now, what we're going to do next is I'm just going to go through a bunch of demos, but first I wanted to kind of level set and make sure that everybody kind of understands the basics of PowerShell syntax. Okay, so a couple of things here. Commandlets always follow a verb-singular noun syntax, typically. That's the design kind of guidance for developers that build commandlets. So that's something to think about. And then we can use get help and get command to learn about the commandlets. Okay, so let me show you kind of a couple of examples here that hammer this home. So one of the commandlets that comes with the Active Directory module is Get-ADUser. But first, if I do get command and say module Active Directory, this will list all of the commandlets that are available in that module, okay? So you can see that there's tons, right? And when we talk about verb-singular noun, if we say get command *-ADUser, so I'm using a wildcard here to say, give me all the commands that have ADUser at the end. You can see here that we've got Get-ADUser, New-ADUser, Remove-ADUser, and then Set-ADUser. So I'm just using wildcards here to look up the commandlets, but those are commandlets that probably work with every day if I'm doing Active Directory administration. Now, when it comes to PowerShell, right, we're following this verb-singular noun kind of naming syntax. If I say Get-ADUser on something like a guy named R. Smith, for example, and that's a user I have in Active Directory already. This is an example of just running one command against one user object. When we hit enter, we get back an object with a bunch of properties, just like we would see if we went into a user account in the graphical tools. Now, it's only going to give you a subset of default attributes by default. I'll show you later how you can kind of override that. But this is kind of the idea, right? We're running a command, we're getting data back. If I was trying to figure out, well, what are the other parameters? Like, what if I wanted to search the entire list of parameters for this commandlet to see how the commandlet works? What if I wanted to filter, things like that? That's where get help comes into play. So I could say get help, get dash help, having trouble typing here, get dash help, new-ADUser. And so when you run this the first time, it's going to tell you to download the help files from Microsoft, which is basically the documentation for how the command works. So when I run that, you can see we get a bunch of stuff back in the terminal, but it's kind of hard to read. I kind of like to do this if I can, and say get help on the commandlet and say online. And this online switch parameter will actually take you out to the graphical documentation for this particular commandlet, new-ADUser, right? So it's insanely cool. And you'll notice over on the right, there's examples and the documentation for all the parameters. And then Brian said in the chat, which is a good pro tip, Copilot is a great tool to look up PowerShell commands and sample usage. So I would totally agree with that. Well, let's say that we're trying to figure out how this commandlet works. We want examples, or we're trying to figure out certain parameters, right? Let's say that we wanted to do kind of a broad search, and we weren't sure like what kind of filtering was happening. We could go through and kind of look at these parameters in here. So I think there's there's one that I was looking for, but the idea here is like maybe we go to the path. Maybe we're trying to figure out the path of, we want to do a query against a certain organizational unit, I should say. That would be the path parameter, right? So I'm not going to go through every parameter here and read the documentation. I'm just kind of showing you, it's a process of figuring out what commandlet do I need, and then how does that commandlet work? We can start by going into the help system, okay? So those are a couple of things. I'll come back to that in a little bit here, but those are just kind of some getting started tips for just understanding the basic workflow. So let's do this. Let's move forward a bit. I'm going to show you a ton of examples here. So first, we'll take a look at querying and managing Active Directory objects in PowerShell. We'll take a look at provisioning users from a CSV file. So from a kind of like an Excel spreadsheet. And we'll look at some reporting scripts where we can go through, do queries, and see kind of what's going on in there. All right. Good stuff. Trying to keep up with the comments here. Let's see, one of them is, excuse me, I do not log into my PC as an admin. If I do so to load RSAT, can I use RSAT from the non-admin user? Yeah, you can. And there would be a credential parameter on the commandlet you're using. And I'll show that when we go through some of the demos here. So that's a really good question. But yeah, let's kind of jump into it here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the PowerShell ISE because I could use Visual Studio Code. I really like Visual Studio Code, but I feel like for demos, it's easier to kind of switch back and forth between the script pane on the top and then the output pane on the bottom. So I can go back and forth. It's easy to demo. It's also pre-installed on Windows, so you can just use this. I know a lot of people like Visual Studio Code, and that's great. All right, so now let's get into this here. We'll talk about doing some queries and stuff like that. In the chat, somebody was saying you can right-click on PowerShell icon and run as an administrator. That's a good tip, especially when you're working locally, all right? Or if you're installing the module and things like that. So that's something that I normally do by default. But you'll notice here, if you look at the ISE, way up at the top, the ISE is running as administrator as well. So I can open the ISE as administrator. If I need to install modules from the command prompt at the bottom, I can do that. Or I can open the regular PowerShell terminal as administrator as well. Okay, so let's go through kind of a filter or a query situation here. I got a bunch of pre-canned stuff available to you. And so let's say that we're trying to look for all the users in our environment. So break this down here. Let me expand this window. So looking at Get-ADUser, if we go through the documentations, we would see that there's a filter parameter that's that basically takes an LDAP filter query. So I could say, hey, give me all the people in a certain that have this certain attribute, or maybe a certain setting within the user account. But if I'm using an asterisk here, again, that's a wildcard. And in the documentation, if I were to look at the help for the filter command or commandlets parameter here, the filter parameter, I should say, it would tell us all the intricacies of how we actually use that. Okay, so let's run Get-ADUser filter star. I'm going to highlight that code, and in the ISE, I'm going to hit F8 to run it. And you can see that we get back all kinds of different objects. So these are all the user objects that are in the directory, okay? And then somebody in the chat said, I thought ISE was going away. Glad it's still there. Yeah, so Microsoft's no longer working on it, but it's still included, thankfully. So that's good stuff. Now, earlier I was talking about the basics of, kind of like verb-noun singular, or excuse me, verb-singular noun naming syntax for commandlets. I didn't really get into the pipeline, but that's a big capability of PowerShell. So remember, when I ran that previous command, when I highlighted it and hit F8, this one here, Get-ADUser filter star, that gave back a bunch of user accounts with tons of different properties. I might want to just see certain bits of information. So let me kind of go back here and run this again. And actually, I'm just going to copy it, and we're going to do this. Bear with me, I'm having a little bit of a breakdown over there. Okay, so Get-ADUser filter star. Remember, it gives us a bunch of objects, right, or a bunch of users. Now, what if I just wanted to see the names and maybe the SAM account name? And so what I could do here, I could do a couple things, but there's one command called select object where you can say, all right, give me just 2 properties off of every object that comes back. And, I just get that information. So using the pipeline, I'm going to show you lots of examples coming up, more advanced than this. But every command is sending objects down the pipeline, and then you can do this pipe character, and then you can process each item that comes out of that collection. And there's also ways to like loop through it, right? So instead of doing select object, sometimes you'll see kind of a syntax like this, where you'll see pipe, and then you'll see people use the for each object. This is kind of a longer way of doing it. The for each object commandlet, basically saying for each object that comes out of this get command, I want to run a script. And so when we're in PowerShell and we're telling PowerShell we want to run a script, we use curly braces. Okay, so if I just wanted like the name, just give me the name, right? I could say Get-ADUser filter star for each object and give me the name. Now this is a little bit of a weird syntax because there's a $_ So what we're saying here is when we're iterating over a collection, every object has a temporary variable $_, and then we can access those properties on the user object. This is a long way of going about it, okay? But if I wanted to run an entire script for every one of those users or run 1 or 2 commands, I could put that in the curly braces. I'm going to show an example of that coming up, all right? Okay, so good stuff so far. Now also, remember I was telling you that the filter parameter supports like this LDAP filter query syntax? We can do things like Get-ADUser, and then the filter, instead of a wildcard saying everybody, we can say, just give me the users where their account is enabled. So we could go on all day with the different LDAP queries here. So I'm not going to do that, but that's one way you can query to just give me the enabled users. And we might even want to do this based on the OU. All right, so check out this example here. Get-ADUser filter star, but filter on the search base of this organizational unit. Okay, so that is the kind of like the typical LDAP syntax for that organizational unit. Now, question for you guys in the chat. What if I don't know, what if I know the name of an OU, but I don't know the actual fully qualified LDAP path? Anybody know where I would get that from? I know I'm a little bit of a delay, so I kind of watch the chat here for a second. But you could get that information in your graphical tools. If you did something like ADSI edit, that would work. So check this out. ADSI edit snap-in comes with those remote server administration tools or your Active Directory administration tools. So when this comes up, this gives you, all of the LDAP information that you would ever need. So if I was looking for my office's OU and I was trying to determine what is the actual office's OU distinguished name, I can get that out of ADSI edit. And then in my scripts, I could use this information, okay? Hopefully that makes sense. That's how I basically, just showing you this example here, that's how I would have figured out how to get the OU path, okay? Yeah, and distinguish name in the OU's attribute editor. Yeah, you can go into the advanced attribute editor in Active Directory users and computers as well. It's a good tip. And then let's see, did I actually have that OU populated? So let's try that. We'll highlight that command, hit F8. Yeah, so we do have user accounts in that particular organizational unit. So we're just querying. Pretty soon we'll get into creating users and all kinds of stuff like that. All right. I'm trying to keep up with the chat here. There's a lot going on. Anyways, all right, cool. Let's move on to updating user accounts and changing some of their settings here. So check out this example here. Set-ADUser on line 4. Okay, so we're saying, I want to change something about R. Smith's configuration on his user account. I want to maybe overwrite one of the attributes values that's on his account. I want to add a new value to an attribute that hasn't been set. There's all kinds of different ways of doing this. In this example here, we're saying replace the title attribute with this value. And this syntax here is kind of weird because like, what is up with this, you know, this @ sign and all this. So this is a hash table in PowerShell. Excuse me. So a hash table is a collection of key value pairs. So title equals district manager. This is a way for us to overwrite that particular title attribute, excuse me, on a user account. Grab a drink of water here. Dying over here. Okay, so going back to the demo here, what I want to show you real quick is let's do a get help on this command, and we'll look at that, some of the parameters here. So get help, get-help, Set-ADUser, online. So take us out to the online documentation. And then the parameters I kind of want to mention here is like, see that we have add, right? Or we have clear kind of in the way of these. So when we run Set-ADUser, we can use the add parameter to add an attribute using that hash table syntax, or we might want to clear it out completely and negate it altogether. I think the one that we were using in the code sample over there was replace. And if we come into the replace documentation, it kind of explains to us, okay, yeah, this is how you would replace a value. And by the way, you can also remove, add, replace, or clear. So that's kind of a cool way of updating the attributes. So sometimes you'll get a request that says, hey, all these people are moved to a different team or changing the team's name or whatever. And then you can just write a quick script that goes through, loops through all those users, makes that change on their account. So kind of interesting approach there. So that's what we're showing in this example when we're doing a Set-ADUser on R. Smith and then replacing the title with district manager. If we hit F8 with that highlighted, that goes ahead and does the job. We don't get any errors back. That means it's a good thing, so it actually worked. If we went into Active Directory users and computers, went to R. Smith's properties, we would see that set. Now there's another way to update user accounts. They call using a local instance. And this is where you store the user account in a variable, then you modify the variable, and then you write back the variable into Active Directory. So that's what this example here is all about. So notice, we get out of the way for this one. On this first line here, we're saying $user equals Get-ADUser. So we're literally going to store the output of that Get-ADUser request in the user variable, okay? And then once we have a reference to that, that variable has properties, because ultimately the user variable is an object with multiple properties. So you see in this example, we're setting the mail attribute to rsmith@ad.local. Obviously that's not a usable email, but you get the idea. We've got the department set. And then finally, we do Set-ADUser with the instance parameter. This is the key here. And saying, what instance do we want to update? Well, we want to update $user. So if you think about it, $user in this case is going to have a reference to the original user that's stored in the database, the Active Directory database. So we're basically just storing that in memory, modifying the attributes, and then using Set-ADUser to write it back, okay? Andy in the chat says, there is add and replace, but if you did not know the attribute exists for a specific user, can you replace for either instance, or would you add? That's a good question. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure if I understand exactly what you're asking. Let me come back to that one a little bit later. If not, I'll follow up and after the webinar, okay? So those are just some of the things from querying. So let's move forward here. Still got plenty of time to go through these other demos. And now let's go into creating user accounts, okay? First, we'll start simple, and then I'll show you how to provision a bunch of users from a CSV file. So that's a pretty common scenario. Somebody comes to you, says, hey, we've got a bunch of new hires, and we want to provision their accounts. Well, you could completely automate that process, right? But let's build one account first, and then we'll go from there. All right, so notice we got New-ADUser, and what I'm doing in the first line here is I'm creating a secure password variable. So before I even get to creating New-ADUser, running New-ADUser to create the account, I'm first building a secure password object. Now this isn't required. You can create the user without a password, you know, that kind of thing, or set it later, all that kind of stuff. But you know, if you're doing a thing where you're like, I want to email the users their initial password, have them reset it when they log in, then you know you can set the initial password this way. So what we're using here is a core commandlet, convert to secure string. And this is just a general Windows PowerShell commandlet. And notice that we're providing the string. You guys like my super secure password here, password 2025. And so we're basically providing this as plain text, which is why this parameter says as plain text, and then just kind of going from there. So this is storing a reference, and it stores it in an encrypted format. So if we highlight that, we hit F8, this may not be something new for some of you more hardcore PowerShell users, but if we look at the password variable, now that it's been created, we just see system.security.secureString. So it is encrypted, and it's not like we can read it out of memory or anything. And you know, there's also places like key stores are a very popular thing these days, HSMs and secret vaults and all that kind of stuff. So you could query this technically from a vault, you know, and just kind of pass it over to this command here to create that secure string object, okay? Now, when it comes to creating a user account, we've got New-ADUser, and then as you might expect, there's tons of parameters to define the input for this information. So if we run New-ADUser, provide the name here, account password is set to the password variable. There's a switch parameter here, essentially saying enabled true, meaning when we create the user account, it's not going to be a disabled user. It would be a user that's enabled with the initial password. You could email the user or something like that, give them the initial password. They log in, change the password at first login, move from there. And so there's all kinds of parameters that control that behavior, right? So if we go back to our method of looking at the help, let's do get help on New-ADUser online. And by default, you know, look at all these parameters, right? It goes on all day. And I think in, you know, just the default user class in Active Directory, man, look at all those parameters. The default user class has over like 300 attributes or something like that. So not every single one are going to show up here, especially if you've extended the schema with some other product in your environment. But ultimately, you want to figure out what attributes do I want to set as I create the user. There's tons in here, okay? I'm going to show you an example of doing more of an advanced input here with numerous parameters, but let's run this entire thing here. So we've already created the password object. We run New-ADUser. It says the specified user already exists. So I actually ran this earlier just to make sure the demos are going to work, but notice it's a pretty descriptive error, right? So the good thing is if you run into errors when you're testing in a development environment, you know, usually if you focus on the error, or even it was said earlier, you know, bounce it off Copilot and see what Copilot says. But usually the errors are pretty descriptive. But in this case, let's just say we'll do G Smith, just to see it work, okay? And then we don't get anything back. So that can be, you know, sometimes that could be a little bit misleading, like, oh, I ran a new thing, but I didn't get any output back. There is a parameter that you can use called pass-through, so you get back an object. So if I said, use this switch parameter pass-through, like I've done here, it's right above my head, I can basically create the user and it'll spit back out the object with the properties, and then you'll know, okay, that was created, or you might want to save that, and I'll show you an example of that later. But watch, if I run this command here, see how I ran it, and this time it gave me an output? So that's just kind of something to think about there. All right, so now that we know how to build a user account basic, let's talk about doing this through a CSV. Okay, so somebody from you know, the HR or whatever gives you a CSV file. You can process that for new employees, build all the accounts. So I'm going to use import CSV. I have a file on the file system called new-users.csv, and this has a list of users in there that I want to create. So notice here that we've got four attributes essentially. So if I was to go into Excel, for example, or Google Sheets or something, I would have, you know, the first row would be the property names that I want to use. So I would name those columns. And then for each row, I would have the information for the user. So I've decided for this use case, I want to supply first and last name. I want to create the SAM account name, first initial, last name, and then I want to have an initial password, right? And so essentially what we're going to do is run import CSV, loop through each one of these records, and for each one of those records, we'll create a new user account using New-ADUser, okay? So let's take a look at that. Now this is going to be a little bit of an advanced example, and before I do that, I kind of want to explain something here real quick. So let's do this. And this comes up in the help for these Active Directory command lists, so I want to kind of explain it before I get started. What I'm going to do though is I'm just going to run a native commandlet, get service that's on any Windows machine. That gives you all the services on a machine. But if I said like get service -name bits, that would just give me that one service. Now, the reason that I'm bringing this up is, what if I wanted to supply all these parameter values using a variable? Because like, what if I have 50 parameters going off to the right side of the screen? I might not want that, right? So we can provide a hash table with all of the parameter values that we want, and that's called parameter splatting. It's kind of a weird concept, or weird name at least, but what I'm saying here is if we created a property bag, like param, a variable, and use a hash table that says key is name equals bits, okay? In a hash table in PowerShell, the property name itself isn't enclosed in quotes, single or double. It's just flat value, and then the values of those would be in either single or double quotes. You only need to use double quotes when you're expanding a variable, so I'm just using single quotes here. But notice I'm creating essentially a hash table with just one key value pair, and ultimately what I'm getting at is I could say get service at param, and then if I had 50 key value pairs in there, it would just map those to the parameters on the commandlet, okay? So I just ran that one there, and it just mapped the one parameter name to bits by just doing this, okay? So I'm showing you that because when you're doing New-ADUser and you got 50 different parameters, sometimes it's a lot easier to define all of those parameter values in a hash table like this and use parameter splatting, which, like I said, is a really weird name. Yeah, Rob said in the chat, can I specify the OU for the user? And you absolutely can. So there is a path variable when you use New-ADUser, and you can provide that LDAP path to the actual organizational unit. Okay. Let's go to moving forward to create from the CSV. So I showed, kind of importing the CSV, right? And we're seeing all the information in the CSV. So let's take a look at more of an advanced kind of process here. So 19 lines of code, but we're doing quite a bit here, right? So the first line, import CSV, and we're doing for each object. Remember I mentioned that earlier? For each object, for each row coming out of the CSV, we want to run a script. So enclosed in curly braces is this entire script. This is my provisioning script, right? So on line 3, I'm creating my password like I did before. And then remember, like I said, when we're looping over each record that comes out of the CSV here, so remember we had like 3 or 4 records, when I'm inside the curly brace, when the script is running, $_ corresponds to the current item coming across the pipeline. So $_given name, the first time it runs, would respond or correspond to that record in that first row. Okay, and then you'll notice here, so I do the same thing for given name and surname, right? So we're getting the password, user's first name and last name. And then here, I'm just doing a regular PowerShell expression, setting a variable rather, where I'm saying $name equals $given name space $surname. Notice that that's in double quotes. So this is variable expansion inside a double quoted string. And what I'm saying here is, I've picked individually the first and last name out of different rows in the CSV, and now I'm kind of bolting them together with the space in the middle. It's just a really easy way in PowerShell, and this works just PowerShell regular, to create your variables, all right? So I'm building the display name using this syntax here. Now going forward, this next block of code is that parameter splatting kind of idea that I was telling you about. So I'm creating pretty much like, sometimes people call this a property bag, but essentially it's an object with multiple properties. And again, these are going to map to the variables on New-ADUser. So all these items over here on the left side, these are actually the parameter names on the New-ADUser commandlet. So we're setting given name and surname. This name here would be the display name, SAM account name, which is going to be first initial, last name coming from the CSV. Notice we've got $_ there. The default password for the user, and then enabled equals true. Okay, and then finally at the bottom, we've got New-ADUser at params, and it's just going to take all of those values out of the CSV for each user it's creating, and it's going to populate all of that. And this, again, if I was doing 10, 15 different parameters, it's a lot easier to read it top down than it is left to right if it's running off the screen, right? So, so let's see. I can't remember if I ran this earlier and the users already exist, maybe, but we'll find out. What I'm going to do here is just highlight all the code, hit F8. Okay, we didn't get anything back, so we know that it created those user accounts. And going back to the question earlier, I could change the OU and all that kind of stuff if I wanted to. Let's see. Yeah, another good question that came up that I'll show is, in addition to the OU, can you define like which group memberships? And absolutely. That'll be something coming up here in just a minute. I've got another example here. It's a little bit more verbose. Notice this is a similar technique, but in this particular script, this is just creating a user account without processing from a CSV. But I provided this in the code samples because as it came up in the questions, remember we were asking about OU and stuff like that? So this is an example where I'm setting the path, right? And I figured out what the OU was, or that could be coming from this CSV, right? Used a few different property names here, or additional property names. But notice, here's the thing, and this actually goes to Rob's question. Check this out. Remember we got pass-through? Anybody remember what pass-through did on New-ADUser? Well, that makes sure that we get a result when New-ADUser runs. And the reason we're doing this one is to answer Rob's question, which was, okay, we create the user account, put them in the right OU, but what about putting them in the right group, right? So we're using pass-through here, so we have a reference to who they were when we created them. So check this out. This time, doing it a little bit different, I'm saying when I run New-ADUser, they're getting stored in this user variable. And like I said earlier, since we're using the pass-through parameter, we're setting it to true in the property bag, and we just run New-ADUser at params. It stores the output in user. Now we have a reference to who just got created. We know it worked. And now we can take that information and then we can manipulate that user further by adding him to the right groups that he's supposed to be in. And that could also be a column in your CSV, right? So taking a look down here, notice that we get the $user. So we get user stored in this variable here. And then we run add AD group member to the sales group, and we're putting him in there, okay? So that's a really good one. And if you could kind of, and I know Russ just shared all the scripts that I'm demoing today, so you can kind of merge these two together. You know, the idea might be, okay, I want to process the entire CSV, create the users, but also add them to one or more groups. You kind of use these two different code samples to combine them together, right? So great questions. Hopefully it's making sense. Let me know if it's making sense. I know there's a bunch of questions. I'm trying to keep up with them as best I can. But hopefully this is good stuff for you guys. So we've seen creating individual user accounts, manipulating the properties, changing the properties if needed. We just saw an example of adding group member. Remember, with verb dash singular noun, beyond add group member or add AD group member, you're going to have remove, all that kind of stuff. So remember, you can use the help to say what other commandlets exist with this new AD or with AD group member, okay? So that's awesome. We've seen provisioning from a CSV. Let's do some group membership reporting. That would be kind of cool. This is more querying, and I'm going to try to show you a couple of more advanced ideas here, okay? So this first one here where we're saying we want to check, you know, basically we want to say, we want to see which groups a user belongs to, okay? So this example here, Get-ADUser, the name of the user, and you'll notice it's using properties member of. This example is important because you only get a default set of interesting properties when you run Get-ADUser. Microsoft decided, all right, these are the most interesting because think about it, at the end of the day, the Active Directory database is a database. And if you're doing a recursive query over hundreds of thousands of user accounts and pulling every single one of those 300 attribute values, it could be pretty intense, right? Memory intense, processor intense. So not all properties are provided by default, and some you might have to define explicitly. That's what's happening here. So by default, you know, member of property or attribute on a user is a list of all the groups they're a member of. So, you know, if I had somebody in 50 groups, and then I just run Get-ADUser, now it's got to recurse 50 groups, right? So they give us this ability to manually tack on this property, but it doesn't do it by default. And then there was a question said, I missed a bunch of stuff, but can you show an example of how to change manager name and email in a particular OU? Yeah, if you look at the code samples from some of the beginning code samples that we were doing with Set-ADUser, there's an example of how to overwrite or replace attributes in there. And I'm sure you'll be able to figure it out that way. I think we got about 15 minutes left, a couple more examples. So we'll move forward on this, okay? But notice here, if I don't think R. Smith is in any groups, but let's highlight that, hit F8, and notice here that the member of is not showing up by default, right? So I think that's why I had in here running it like this in parentheses. And actually, let me get out of this way here. So when you run a command and put it in parentheses, this is just like putting it in a variable and then accessing the properties. So if I run this command here, you can see that we're not getting any output. So there's no values set for R. Smith's member of. He's not in any Active Directory groups, but if he was, that would show up in the list here, okay? Now, this example here is showing like looping through all the groups that person is. So ultimately, this script is about figuring out which groups this guy's a member of and then exporting a report of that information, okay? So what we're doing here is, if you look at this line, we're basically saying, hey, let's get this guy's member of property. And you'll notice here, this is kind of a weird syntax, like what's going on here? Well, the % sign is actually an alias for the for each object commandlet. So technically I could do this for each object. And what we're doing here is we're basically getting a list of all the groups. See how we're doing Get-AD group on $_. So if this guy did have like 5 different groups in this member of property, we could loop through each one and then get a list of those group names, okay? So this is just your standard iteration over a list of values, all right? It's just kind of a weird way of doing it with the way that the Active Directory commandlets work, okay? Now, down here, I'm actually building a report. So the whole use case of this one here is to figure out what groups the guy is in and build a report for that, right? So this command down here is kind of a long one, and it's an example of really taking advantage of the pipeline. So notice that we've got Get-AD group member, identity marketing, and then just selecting some of the attributes for that group, and then exporting to CSV. So even though these are all on different lines, notice the pipe character at the end of each line. Technically, this is a one-liner. So this is listing members of a particular group. The top example was figuring out what groups a user belongs to. So in this top example, it didn't show saving to a CSV, but you could continue piping that on. And that's what the bottom example is showing. The bottom example is showing how to run a query against something, pipe it over to select object to grab the values that you want or the properties you want, and then we're piping again to export CSV. And in this case, it would tell us who are all the group members of the marketing group, okay? This no type information switch parameter, just make sure there's not weird information in the CSV file, okay? But this is just a way to do exporting for group memberships, all right? Okay, last one here we're gonna do is Active Directory cleanup and reporting tasks. So the idea with this example is, let's say you want to find inactive users, inactive accounts, you want to identify empty groups. These are just kind of a couple of common administrative tasks on top of creating users, putting users in groups, that kind of thing, okay? Now this first code sample is kind of intricate because we're doing Get-ADUser, right? Filter star. But what we're doing here is we want to figure out the last logon date, like how long has it been since they logged in, all that kind of stuff. And we're trying to identify inactive accounts here, right? So this first line is give me all the users and add that property last logon date. And then we're piping it, even though we're hitting return here and adding a new line. This is still technically a one-liner. So after the pipe character, we're saying where object. And this is our commandlet that's built into core PowerShell that allows us to do filtering just like you would with like a SQL query. So we're saying where a certain object meets this criteria, then return that, right? So if we wanted to get a list of all the people who haven't logged in the last 90 days, that's what we're doing here. So for each of the user objects that comes across the pipeline, we're saying where last logon date is less than get date. So we're formatting a date here. Watch, if we do this, we just highlight this one command and hit F8. See how it says down at the bottom? Let me clear that and run it one more time. Hit F8. See how it says Saturday, July 26, 2025. So we're constructing a date. And the syntax for this is kind of weird, right? Because we're wrapping get date in parentheses, just saying, pretty much instead of storing it in a variable, we're saying run this expression, and I'm tacking on the method at the end to remove 90 days to construct a date that was 90 days ago. And that's what this is here. So we're pretty much saying with that report, I want to find inactive users, and we're just looking for anybody that hasn't logged in since July 26, right? And then again, kind of like we saw before, we could continue piping that out. But notice in this scenario, we're just saving that output in $users. And then we're exporting $users using the pipeline. We're saying $users piped over to export CSV. We provide a file path for the CSV, And it's just going to take that list and give us a list of users that are potentially inactive and haven't been logging in. Okay, and then finally, this one's a little bit more of an advanced example down here. And this was an example for identifying empty groups. Now, this is an example of running a loop, looping over multiple items, but also doing a conditional check. So kind of an advanced and honestly kind of ugly code sample. It's kind of, when you look at it, it kind of messes with your brain a little bit because there's so many weird characters and stuff. But essentially what we're doing here is, remember, we're doing for each object. We're processing, we're basically running a script block for each item that comes across. And the first thing we do is we do an if statement. So we do a comparison in the first kind of iteration. And we're essentially saying, if Get-AD group member equals null, then we're going to select a couple different properties here, right? So we're going to get the name of the group, the distinguished name of the group, export everything to a CSV. We'd have a list of groups that are empty, and maybe they're just sitting there and we don't need them anymore. So that's just a cleanup scenario, right? So good stuff. Got a couple minutes left here. I'm going to answer some of the questions. See, Brian says I use a script that helps me protect users, that finds last password reset, calculates when it expires, to help them remind users to change their password. It saves me time resetting when they're locked out. Yeah, that's an awesome scenario. And so once you start to get the kind of hang of doing that, like Brian was talking about, using the commandlets, you start to get all these interesting ideas. And now with things like Copilot, we can, you're no longer stuck. You've got somebody to tell you how things work here. Let's see. Looks like Russ was answering some questions there. Thanks, Russ. Oh, then there was a question about Get-AD principal group membership instead of member of. Yeah, that's a good question. And what would be the difference? Yeah, so I'd have to look at that commandlet, but I think I would just go to the help for that commandlet. Off the top of my head, I don't know the answer to that one. So good question, though. All right, and then we're talking a little bit. Oh, yeah, then Jay showed a good code sample for listing disabled user accounts. So I use this for disable user listing. Is this overkill? Oh, no, I don't think so. The code sample, so you were looking where, yeah, you're just getting disabled accounts. So where enabled equals false. No, I think that's a good script. The one I was showing was looking for inactive users that haven't logged in a while. So that's why that one was a little bit more advanced. I think that one looks good, Jay. All right. Another question was, what does $_ stand for? Good question. So $_ is the temporary variable in a loop. So let's show another example real quick. So we can get Get-ADUser on rsmith, right? rsmith, can't spell today. And so notice there's like the name property, right? Like if we were doing, so imagine we're processing multiple users, right? For each object. We're really just doing one, but for the sake of demonstration, when I run for each object and then I'm accessing $_, like imagine I just ran Get-ADUser filter star and I get back 1,000 objects because I got 1,000 users in there. Every time for each object runs, it's going to run for each item coming out of that query from the get command. And when we're processing the current item in that iteration, $_ corresponds to that record or that user in this case. And we know the user has a name property. And so in that script block, we're doing $_, which is the temporary variable as we iterate through that list. Awesome stuff. Good question. Thank you for that. Okay, I think we're getting close to the end here. So I just wanted to share a couple of other things. So if you're a StormWind subscriber, I know we got a lot of subscribers here with us. I wanted to let you know I've got 2 courses that just hit the platform. These are Bytes courses, and they're pretty short. The videos don't go past like 4 minutes. And it's really just showing you the core foundations of PowerShell. So in this first course, you'll find on the StormWind platform. This is about an hour long, and I go through all the basics of PowerShell, like working with commandlets, how to get help, how to deal with the pipeline, how to process groups of information or loop through and iterate over collections, conditional logic, all kinds of stuff like that. So check that out if you're completely brand new to PowerShell. And then I've also got PowerShell automation for administrators. This is about 2 hours on there, but I go into all the stuff I show you today, go into running PowerShell from CI/CD pipelines, doing all kinds of interesting stuff. So if you're kind of watching today and you're like, wow, this is an insane amount of information. I know that if this was my first time, my brains would be blown out. So if you're new to PowerShell and you're watching this today and you're like, man, I want to go back over this stuff, check out those courses that are available now. And if you're new to StormWind completely, you're not really sure who we are, well, obviously we're one of the biggest training companies out there, over 500 courses. I think it's well over 500 by now across IT, cybersecurity, AI, full stack development, project management, compliance, and DevOps, and the list goes on. If you're interested, contact Mike. His information's here up on the screen if you'd like to sign up. But with that, I would like to say thank you for joining today. I'll hang around in the chat to answer questions and maybe circle back to one of those ones I might have missed. And go Dodgers, right? So thanks, everybody. See you next time.